The late afternoon sun hung low over Willow Creek, casting golden streaks across the quiet suburban streets. Eleanor Brooks gripped the steering wheel of her old sedan, her knuckles pale against the cracked leather. The weekend at her friend's cabin by Lake Heron had been a rare escape, a few days of solitude, the scent of pine and the soft lap of water against the dock. She'd felt lighter there, almost young again. But now, as she turned onto Maple Lane, her heart sank like a stone dropped into still water. Her house came into view, a modest 2-story with white siding and a wraparound porch, the home she'd poured 40 years into. The rose bushes she'd tended since William's passing lined the front yard, their petals vibrant against the green. But something was wrong. The bushes were trampled, their stems snapped like brittle bones. Her pots of lavender and lilies, nurtured through countless seasons, lay shattered in the driveway, their soil spilling like blood across the concrete. Eleanor's breath caught. She slowed the car, her eyes scanning the scene. In the middle of the lawn, a pile of her belongings rose like a mountain of discarded dreams. Her clothes, neatly folded sweaters now muddied, spilled from a torn suitcase, photo albums, their pages fluttering in the breeze, lay scattered among chipped teacups and William's old fishing rod, its handle worn smooth by his hands. Her knees buckled as she stepped out, gripping the car door to steady herself. "Surely this is a mistake," she whispered, her voice trembling. Surely they wouldn't. But then she saw it, a piece of paper taped to the front door, flapping like a white flag of surrender. Her legs moved as if through water, each step heavy, deliberate. The neighbor's eyes burned into her from across the street. Mrs. Dorothy Evans clutched her gardening gloves, her mouth half open. The Johnson kids, usually loud with their bikes, stood frozen on their porch, wide-eyed. Eleanor felt their pity like needles pricking her skin. She reached the door and tore the note free. The handwriting was unmistakable James's, neat and confident, just as it had been on the school essays she used to proofread late at night. Her eyes blurred as she read, "Dear Mom, I'm sorry. Sarah's parents are moving in with us. There's no room for you anymore. Please don't make a scene. We hope you understand. James." The words sliced through her, sharp as a blade between her ribs. Her own son, the boy she'd rocked through fevers, whose scraped knees she'd bandaged, whose dreams she'd funded with every spare penny. She'd cooked for him and Sarah, babysat Liam after school, given up her own plans, weekend trips, retirement cruises to keep their family afloat. And now this? Eleanor's hand shook, crumpling the note. She knocked on the door, softly at first, as if hoping it was all a cruel joke. No answer. She pounded harder, her heart thumping so loudly it drowned out the chirping sparrows. The door opened a crack, and James peeked out, his face pale, his eyes avoiding hers. Behind him, Sarah appeared, arms crossed, her lips curled in a sneer that made Eleanor's stomach twist. "Mom, it's better this way," James mumbled, shifting his weight like a teenager caught sneaking in late. Sarah's voice cut through, sharp enough to draw blood. "You've had your time here. Eleanor, my parents need comfort in their old age. You're independent. You'll manage." Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came. She tried to recall the last time she'd asked for anything a favor, a moment of their time. She couldn't. She'd given everything, and they'd taken it all, only to discard her like an old rug. James reached out, not to comfort her, but to push the door closed. The lock clicked, a sound that echoed in her skull like a gunshot. She stood there, the June heat pressing against her, sweat rolling down her spine. The note was still clutched in her hand, its edges biting into her palm. "They loved my house more than they ever loved me," she thought, the realization settling like ash in her chest. Neighbors whispered, their voices a low hum, but no one approached. She didn't blame them. Who wanted to tangle in someone else's humiliation? Eleanor's eyes fell to the pile on the lawn. A photo album lay open, a picture of Liam grinning with a sparkler on a summer night. Her heart ached, but something else stirred a dangerous calm, like the hush before a storm. She wasn't defeated. Not yet. She bent down, her joints protesting, and picked up a small suitcase, its handle worn but sturdy. One bag. That's all she needed now. As she walked away, the neighborhood's stares followed her, but she held her head high. Each step felt heavier, yet somehow lighter, as if she were shedding an invisible weight. She didn't know where she was going, not exactly, but she knew she was done being used. By dusk, Eleanor found herself at Riverside Park, a cracked green bench, her only refuge. She clutched the suitcase, its weight grounding her as the world spun on. Children laughed nearby, chasing fireflies. An old man tossed breadcrumbs to pigeons. A young couple argued over a spilled coffee, their voices sharp but fleeting. And there she sat, invisible, her hands smudged with dirt from salvaging her photo albums. She looked down at her fingers, once strong enough to knead bread every Sunday, to plant every hydrangea in that yard. They trembled now, but they were hers. She thought of the mornings in that house, the hush before dawn, when she'd slip into the garden with a cup of black tea, the dew wetting her slippers. She could almost hear Liam's small feet pattering down the hallway, his sleepy voice calling, "Grandma, can I help water the roses today?" Tears pricked her eyes, but she wiped them away, refusing to let them fall. She pulled out a crumpled tissue and dabbed at her forehead, pretending it was only sweat. An older woman passing by gave her a sympathetic look but kept walking. Eleanor didn't mind. She didn't need pity. She needed clarity. As the sun dipped below the trees, her thoughts churned like fog, heavy and shapeless. But somewhere in that haze, a truth began to crystallize. She'd given them everything: her time, her savings, her heart, and they'd thrown her out without a second thought. The note burned in her pocket, a reminder of their betrayal. But it also sparked something else, something harder, sharper. Eleanor stood, her knees aching, but her spine straighter than it had been in years. She didn't know what came next, but she knew this being alone was better than being used. With the suitcase in hand, she walked into the fading light, each step a quiet promise to herself. They thought they'd broken her. They had no idea she was just beginning. The night air in Willow Creek carried a faint chill, wrapping around Eleanor Brooks as she stood outside a red brick building tucked between a gallery and a flower shop. Studio 7. The faded sign read, its letters peeling like old memories. Her fingers, still smudged with dirt from the lawn, fumbled in her purse until they closed around a small key she hadn't touched in years. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open, releasing a musty scent of old paint and dried flowers. Inside, the studio was sparse. A narrow bed, a worn armchair, a kitchenette with chipped tiles, but to Eleanor, it was a sanctuary. She set her suitcase down, the thud echoing in the quiet. Moonlight filtered through dusty blinds, casting thin stripes across the floor. Her legs ached, her shoulders burned, but for the first time since seeing her life piled on the lawn, she exhaled without feeling like her lungs were full of glass. Kicking off her shoes, she stretched her tired feet on the cool floor, letting the silence settle over her like a soft blanket. Eleanor's mind drifted to the past, to the house on Maple Lane where every corner held a memory. She saw James at 5, clutching her hand during a thunderstorm, his chubby cheeks streaked with tears. "Mama, you'll keep me safe." "Right?" he'd asked, and she'd promised, her heart swelling. She remembered teaching him to ride a bike in the driveway, his laughter ringing as he wobbled forward, her hand steadying the seat. And William, her late husband, his voice warm as he'd say, Don't sign away what's yours. Ellie, not even to family. Love without respect is just a cage. Back then, she'd thought he was overly cautious. Now, his words echoed like a warning she'd ignored. The note from James still burned in her pocket. Its words seared into her mind. No room for you anymore. She pulled it out, smoothing its creases, and stared at her son's handwriting. How had the boy who'd fallen asleep on her lap become the man who'd locked her out? She thought of Sarah, her sharp smile and sharper words, and the way James had changed since she entered his life, less her son, more a stranger chasing Sarah's ambitions. A sharp rap at the door jolted her from her thoughts. Eleanor froze, her pulse quickening. It was past 9, too late for visitors in Willow Creek. She crept to the door, peering through the peephole. Margaret Maggie Thompson stood outside, her silver hair glowing under the street lamp, a paper bag of cinnamon rolls clutched in her hands. "Eleanor, it's me," Maggie called softly. "I heard what happened." Eleanor hesitated, then opened the door. Maggie's eyes widened, taking in Eleanor's disheveled sweater and dirt-streaked face. "Oh, my God. Are you okay?" she asked. Stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, she set the rolls on the table and squeezed Eleanor's hand, her touch warm and grounding. "They kicked you out, didn't they?" Maggie's voice dropped to a whisper, her face a mix of anger and pity. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. Maggie leaned closer, her words careful but urgent. "I wasn't going to say anything, but I overheard Sarah at the farmer's market a few weeks ago. She was bragging to some woman about selling your house once you were out of the way. Said they'd use the money to pay off her parents' debts and live comfortably. She sounded so cold, like she'd already decided your future." Eleanor's stomach twisted, a sour knot forming in her chest. She sank into the armchair, her hands gripping the armrests. "They planned this," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "They wanted the house, not me." Maggie nodded, her lips tight. "I wanted to tell you sooner, but I didn't know how. I'm so sorry, Ellie." The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. Eleanor pressed a hand to her heart, trying to steady the storm inside. She saw James's face as a boy, his bright eyes trusting her completely. She saw Sarah's fake smiles at family dinners, calling her mom for the neighbor's benefit, and she saw herself, always giving cooking, babysitting Liam, dipping into her savings to prop up James's failing business, all for nothing. But then something shifted. The fog in her mind began to clear, like sunlight piercing a storm. She thought of William's voice again. Love without respect is just a cage. She'd been trapped in that cage for years, shrinking herself to keep the peace, believing family loyalty would protect her. She'd been a fool, but she wasn't broken. Eleanor stood, her knees protesting, but her spine straighter than it had been in decades. She walked to the kitchenette, filled a kettle, and set it on the stove. As it hissed to life, she turned to Maggie, her voice steady. "I need to know where I stand. Legally, the house, it's still mine. Isn't it?" Maggie's eyes widened, then softened with a glimmer of admiration. "You're going to fight back." "I have to," Eleanor said, the words anchoring her. She pulled out her phone, scrolling to a contact she hadn't called in years, Henry Davis. William's best friend, a retired lawyer with a sharp mind and a kind heart. Her thumb hovered over the call button, her chest tight with a mix of fear and resolve. This was it, the moment she'd either rise or fall. She pressed the button. The phone rang twice before Henry's groggy voice answered. "Ellie." "Is everything all right, Henry?" she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I need your help. Can you meet me tomorrow?" He didn't hesitate. "Of course. 9 o'clock, my office." Eleanor hung up, her fingers no longer trembling. The kettle whistled, shrill and insistent, but she moved slowly, deliberately, measuring out jasmine tea leaves. As the floral scent filled the room, she felt a spark ignite in her chest, a dangerous, thrilling clarity. James and Sarah thought they'd won, that she'd fade quietly into the shadows. They had no idea what she was capable of. She sat at the small table, sipping her tea, the steam curling like a promise. The studio's walls seemed to pulse with possibility, no longer a relic of her past, but a foothold for her future. Outside, Willow Creek slept, its streets quiet under the stars. But inside Eleanor, a fire was kindling, and it would not be extinguished. The morning sun crept through the dusty blinds of Studio 7, painting golden stripes across Eleanor Brooks' small table. She sat with a chipped mug of jasmine tea, the steam curling like whispers of resolve. The events of the previous day, James's note, the pile of her life on the lawn, Maggie's revelation about Sarah's plan still churned in her mind, but the fog of shock was lifting. In its place, a steady determination took root, fragile but unyielding, like the first green shoot after a long winter. Eleanor's phone buzzed, Henry Davis's name flashing on the screen. She answered, her voice calmer than she felt. "Ellie." "I've looked into the property records," Henry said, his tone brisk but warm. "The house is still in your name, but there's a complication. James and Sarah have hired a lawyer to claim you agreed to transfer ownership. We'll need solid evidence to counter them: deeds, mortgage records, anything from William's estate." Her heart sank, but she nodded, as if he could see her. "I'll find what I can. Thank you." Henry, hanging up. She stared at the suitcase by the bed, its contents all that remained of her life on Maple Lane. Somewhere in that battered case were the papers she needed proof that the house was hers, not just a gift she'd given away in a moment of trust. She knelt beside the suitcase, her joints protesting, and began sorting through the salvaged remnants. Photo albums spilled open, revealing faded images: James at 10, grinning as he held a trout from a fishing trip with William, Eleanor and William on their 20th anniversary, laughing over burnt steaks on the patio. Each memory stung, but she pushed through, digging until her fingers closed around a manila envelope. Inside were old documents, tax records, a copy of the mortgage, William's will. Her breath caught as she read the title deed, her name bold and clear beside his. "You were right, William," she whispered. "Never sign it away." But doubt crept in, cold and heavy. James hadn't always been the man who'd locked her out. She remembered him at 16, his face crumpled after a fight with a friend, seeking her advice on the porch swing. "You always know what to do." "Mom," he'd said, his trust absolute. When had that boy slipped away? She thought of Sarah's influence, her honeyed words masking sharp ambition, and James's business struggles, how he'd come to her for loans, each thank you emptier than the last. Had she enabled his drift, pouring love into a void that couldn't hold it? A knock at the door broke her reverie. Maggie Thompson stood outside, her silver hair tucked under a scarf, a determined glint in her eyes. "I'm taking you somewhere," she said, not waiting for a reply. "You need people who understand." Eleanor followed, uncertain but curious, as Maggie drove them to a community center on the edge of Willow Creek. Inside, a circle of women, some gray-haired, others younger but weary, sat around a table, sharing coffee and stories. Maggie introduced her to the group, called Silver Resilience, a haven for women who'd faced betrayal or loss. One woman, Clara, spoke of her daughter cutting ties for inheritance money. Another, Ruth, described a husband who'd left her for a younger model. Their voices, raw but steady, mirrored Eleanor's pain, and for the first time, she felt less alone. Clara squeezed her hand. "You're not invisible. Eleanor, not here." The words landed like a lifeline, pulling her from the edge of despair. She shared her story, haltingly at first, then with a quiet fire, the group's nods urging her on. When she finished, Ruth said, "You're stronger than you know. Don't let them take that from you." Eleanor's throat tightened, but she managed a small smile. The first in days. Back at the studio that afternoon, Eleanor sifted through more papers, her resolve bolstered by the women's words. She found a letter from William, tucked inside the will, its ink faded but legible. "Ellie, the house is our legacy, not just bricks and mortar. Keep it safe, for you and James, but never let it chain you." Tears pricked her eyes, not from grief, but from clarity. She wasn't just fighting for the house, she was fighting for herself. Her phone pinged with a text from an unknown number. "Grandma, it's Liam. Are you okay?" Her heart lurched. She pictured her grandson, 8 years old, his wide eyes and messy hair, the way he'd trail her in the garden, watering can in hand. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she typed, pausing before adding, "I love you." Moments later, another message came. "Do you hate me? I heard Mom and Dad talking about the house." The words pierced her, sharp and sudden. "Never," she replied, her fingers trembling. "You're my joy, always." Liam's message stirred a fresh wave of conflict. Could she fight James and Sarah without hurting him? She imagined his confusion, caught between parents he trusted and the grandmother he loved. But she couldn't stop now. The house wasn't just hers, it was Liam's future, too, and she wouldn't let Sarah's greed steal it. Eleanor returned to the envelope, pulling out the mortgage contract. A yellowed note in William's handwriting was clipped to it, listing dates and payments, proof they'd paid off the house together. Her pulse quickened. This was the evidence Henry needed. She snapped photos of the documents and emailed them to him, her hands steady despite the storm in her chest. As dusk settled over Willow Creek, Eleanor stood at the studio's narrow window, watching the town's lights flicker to life. The community center's warmth lingered, as did Liam's words and William's letter. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The women of Silver Resilience, Henry's expertise, and her own stubborn heart, they were her arsenal. James and Sarah thought they'd buried her in shame, but they'd misjudged her. She was no longer the woman who'd bend to keep peace. Eleanor poured another cup of tea, its floral scent grounding her. She sat at the table, the document spread before her like a map to her future. The fight was just beginning, and it would be fierce, but for the first time in years, she felt ready. Outside, the stars blinked in the vast sky, and inside, Eleanor's resolve burned brighter still, a flame no one could extinguish. The Willow Creek diner buzzed with the clink of coffee cups and the murmur of early morning gossip. Eleanor Brooks sat in a corner booth, her navy coat buttoned tight despite the warm July air filtering through the open windows. A cup of jasmine tea steamed before her, its floral scent a quiet anchor in the storm brewing in her chest. She'd agreed to meet James and Sarah here, at their insistence, but this wasn't a reconciliation. It was a chess move, and Eleanor was no longer playing their game. She glanced out the window, watching Main Street come alive, shopkeepers sweeping sidewalks, dog walkers chatting under the oaks. The town's pulse felt distant, as if she were observing it through a fogged lens. Her fingers brushed the manila envelope in her purse, containing the mortgage records and William's will, now safely with Henry Davis. Yesterday, Henry had confirmed he'd enlisted a discreet real estate firm to list the house, keeping it under wraps to avoid tipping off James and Sarah. Every step was calculated, every word measured. They thought they'd broken her, but she was just getting started. The diner door swung open, and James stepped in, his shoulders hunched, eyes darting like a man expecting an ambush. Sarah followed, her designer purse clutched tightly, her face a mask of forced calm. They slid into the booth across from Eleanor, the vinyl creaking under their weight. The air thickened, charged with unspoken accusations. "Mom," James began, his voice tight. "We're so glad you came. We owe you an apology." His words sounded rehearsed, like lines from a script he didn't believe. He reached for her hand, but Eleanor folded hers in her lap, her gaze steady. His eyes flickered. A flash of something guilt. Perhaps before he looked away, Sarah took over, her smile sharp as a blade. "We got heated. Eleanor. It was a misunderstanding, really. We're under so much stress my parents have nowhere to go, and we thought, since you're so independent, you wouldn't mind staying elsewhere for a while." Her voice was honeyed, but it slipped around the truth like oil on water, smooth and deceptive. Eleanor's mind flashed to a memory of Sarah, years ago, at a family barbecue. She'd called Eleanor Mom loudly, her arm around her as neighbors watched, but later, behind closed doors, she'd snapped. "Your decorating is so outdated. We'll modernize when it's ours." Eleanor had laughed it off then, chalking it up to Sarah's bluntness. Now, she saw it for what it was, a plan, laid brick by brick, easier for who Eleanor cut in. Her voice calm but slicing through Sarah's script. James swallowed, glancing at his wife. Sarah's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. Reaching into her purse to produce a thick envelope, she slid it across the table, her nails gleaming under the diner's fluorescent lights. "These are property transfer papers," Sarah said, her tone smooth as glass. "We thought, if you signed them now, it'd clear everything up. We could move forward as a family." The last word hung in the air, heavy with irony. Eleanor stared at the envelope, her hands itching to tear it apart. She thought of Sarah's past, pieced together from fragments over the years. Sarah had grown up in a crumbling apartment, her parents buried in debt, always one missed payment from eviction. She'd clawed her way to stability, marrying James not for love, but for the promise of a house, a future. Eleanor had pitied her once, even admired her drive. Now, she saw only greed, dressed up in designer clothes. The diner's chatter faded, all eyes subtly turning to their booth. Mrs. Dorothy Evans, sipping coffee at the counter, whispered to the barista. The Johnson kid's mother, wiping a table nearby, paused, her rag still. Willow Creek thrived on stories, and Eleanor's was spreading like wildfire. "I'll think about it," Eleanor said, her voice even. Pushing the envelope back toward Sarah, she stood, smoothing her coat, and picked up her purse. Sarah's eyes hardened, her laugh forced. "Of course. We knew you'd be reasonable," she said, but her voice cracked at the edges, betraying her panic. James finally looked up, really looked at her, his face pale. "Mom, please," he said, but Eleanor was already moving toward the door. She heard Sarah hiss behind her. "What does she mean? Think about it. She's supposed to sign today." The words followed Eleanor like a shadow, but she stepped into the sunlight, a quiet surge of triumph rising in her chest. Back at Studio 7, Eleanor sat at her small table, the unsigned envelope untouched beside her cup of tea. She'd bought time, kept James and Sarah off balance, just as Henry had advised. He'd called earlier, confirming the house was listed under a private sale, invisible to public records. "They won't know until it's sold," he'd said. His voice tinged with admiration. "You're playing this smart. Ellie." She opened a photo album salvaged from the lawn, pausing on a picture of James at graduation, his arms around her, his hug so tight she'd laughed about cracked ribs. Where had that boy gone? She thought of Sarah's influence, how she'd fed James's insecurities, his failing business, his fear of losing her. Eleanor had poured money into his dreams, thinking it was love. Now, she saw it as a transaction, one she'd paid for too long. Her phone buzzed a message from Maggie Thompson. "Heard you faced them at the diner. Proud of you. Town's talking Dorothy's telling everyone how they treated you." Eleanor smiled faintly. Willow Creek's gossip was a double-edged sword, But today, it cut in her favor. The community's whispers were building pressure, hemming James and Sarah in. Eleanor stood, stretching her aching joints, and walked to the window. The arts district glowed under street lamps, alive with possibility. She thought of the Silver Resilience Group, their stories of survival echoing her own. She thought of Liam's text, his innocent question, "Do you hate me?" and her promise to protect his future. And she thought of William, his voice steady in her memory. "Keep it safe, but never let it chain you." She picked up her phone and dialed Henry. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. "Whatever it takes to keep the house out of their hands." His reply was swift. "Good. They're pushing for a fight, but we've got the upper hand. Rest tonight, Ellie. Tomorrow, we tighten the net." Eleanor hung up, her fingers steady. She poured another cup of tea, its warmth spreading through her. The studio's walls seemed to hum with her resolve. No longer a hiding place, but a war room. James and Sarah thought they could bully her into silence, but they'd misjudged her strength. Outside, Willow Creek stirred, its whispers growing louder. Inside, Eleanor prepared, a flame kindled in her heart, ready to burn through their lies. The Willow Creek courthouse loomed over Main Street, its brick facade stern under the gray July sky. Eleanor Brooks sat in the front row of the small courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the navy coat she'd worn to the diner now buttoned against the air-conditioned chill. The room buzzed with murmurs. Neighbors, reporters from the local paper, and curious townsfolk packed the benches, their whispers like static in the air. Eleanor felt their eyes, not pitying now, but expectant, as if Willow Creek itself awaited her next move. Across the room, Sarah Brooks sat beside a slick-haired lawyer, her face pale but defiant, her designer purse perched like a shield. James slumped next to her, his tie crooked, his gaze fixed on the floor. Eleanor's heart twitched at the sight of her son, but she pushed the ache aside. She'd given him everything: years, savings, love, and he'd chosen Sarah's greed over her. Today, she was here to reclaim what was hers. Henry Davis, sharp in a wrinkled blazer, leaned close. "We've got them." "Ellie," he whispered, tapping the folder of documents on the table. Mortgage records, William's will, the title deed, all bearing Eleanor's name. Sarah's claim of an oral agreement won't hold. Just stay steady. Eleanor nodded, her spine rigid, her resolve a quiet fire in her chest. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair, called the room to order. Sarah's lawyer rose, his voice smooth as he spun a tale of Eleanor's supposed promise to transfer the house to James and Sarah, a family agreement made over dinner years ago. He painted Eleanor as a forgetful widow, confused about her own intentions. Eleanor's fingers curled into her palms, but she kept her face calm, her eyes locked on the judge. Henry stood, his voice steady but fierce. "Your Honor, my client, Eleanor Brooks, is the sole legal owner of the property at 42 Maple Lane. We have irrefutable evidence deeds, mortgage records, and a will from her late husband, William Brooks, all confirming her ownership." He presented the documents, each page a brick in the wall Eleanor was building. The defendant's claim of an oral agreement lacks any substantiation and contradicts the legal record. The judge reviewed the papers, her expression unreadable. Sarah shifted, whispering urgently to her lawyer. James glanced at Eleanor, his eyes red-rimmed, but she looked away. She remembered him at 20, standing proud at his college graduation, hugging her so fiercely she'd laughed about cracked ribs. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who'd left her belongings on the lawn. The judge called Sarah to the stand. She strode forward, her heels clicking, her chin high but her hands trembling. "Mrs. Brooks," Henry began, his tone deceptively gentle. "You claim Eleanor agreed to transfer the house. Can you provide any written proof of contract, an email, even a text?" Sarah's lips tightened. It was a family matter. We didn't need papers. She said it at dinner, years ago, that the house would be ours for Liam's future. Her voice wavered, and Eleanor saw the lie in her eyes. Fragile as glass. Henry pressed, holding up the title deed. This document, signed by Eleanor and William Brooks, names only Eleanor as owner. Were you aware of this when you asked her to sign transfer papers at the diner? Sarah's face flushed, her fingers twisting her purse strap. We thought she'd forgotten. She's old. You know, sometimes confused. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Mrs. Dorothy Evans, seated behind Eleanor, let out a sharp huff. Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent, letting Henry's questions do the cutting. So, you assumed my client, who paid every mortgage installment and maintained the property for 40 years, was too confused to understand her own rights. Henry's voice rose, each word a hammer strike. Isn't it true you planned to sell the house to settle your parents' debts? As you told a friend at the farmer's market. Sarah's eyes widened, her composure cracking. That's a lie, she snapped. But her voice broke, and the courtroom stirred. The judge's gavel rapped for order. Eleanor caught Maggie Thompson's nod from the back, a silent reminder of the market gossip that had unraveled Sarah's plan. James was called next, his steps heavy as he took the stand. "Mr. Brooks," Henry asked, "did you witness this alleged agreement?" James hesitated, his hands gripping the stand. Mom always said the house was for family. I thought she meant us." His voice faltered, and for a moment, Eleanor saw the boy who'd run to her after a scraped knee. But then she remembered the note, the locked door, and her heart hardened. "Did you or your wife ever discuss selling the house without Eleanor's consent?" Henry pressed. James's mouth opened, then closed, his eyes darting to Sarah. "We talked about options," he mumbled. The admission hung in the air, heavy as guilt. The judge's questions were sharp, probing Sarah's and James's contradictions. As their lawyer scrambled to redirect, Eleanor felt a warmth bloom in her chest, not relief, but power, like a river finding its course. The courtroom, once a place of dread, now felt like her stage. When the judge delivered her ruling, her voice was clear. Based on the evidence, I find no basis for the defendant's claim. The property remains solely in Eleanor Brooks' name. The case is dismissed. Her gavel struck, a sound that echoed like a door slamming shut on Sarah's schemes. Sarah let out a strangled sob, collapsing into her seat, her mascara streaking. James sat frozen, his hands covering his face. The courtroom erupted in whispers, reporters scribbling furiously. Dorothy Evans clapped softly, and Maggie's eyes shone with pride. Eleanor exhaled, her shoulders dropping, the weight of years lifting just a fraction. Outside, the gray sky had cleared, sunlight breaking through. Henry patted her arm. "You did it. Ellie, the house is yours to do with as you please." Eleanor nodded, her voice low. "Not just for me, Henry. For every woman told to stay quiet, to disappear." His smile was quiet, respectful. As she stepped onto Main Street, the town's pulse felt alive, its whispers now a chorus of support. News of the ruling would spread by evening, Dorothy and her neighbors ensuring every coffee shop and market stall knew the truth. Eleanor's victory was no longer hers alone, it was Willow Creek's, too. Back at Studio 7, Eleanor sat with her tea, the courtroom's echoes still ringing in her mind. She opened her photo album, pausing on a picture of Liam, his sparkler glowing in the summer night. She'd won this battle. But the war wasn't over. James and Sarah would fight harder now, desperate and cornered. Let them come, she thought, her fingers steady on the cup. They'd taken everything they could, but they couldn't break her. Not anymore. The rain fell in a cold, steady drizzle over Willow Creek, soaking the sidewalks of Maple Lane and turning the lawns to mud. Eleanor Brooks stood at the corner of her old street, an umbrella resting lightly on her shoulder, her navy coat damp but her posture unyielding. The house at number 42 loomed ahead, its white siding dulled by the gray light, its porch empty of the rocking chairs she'd once loved. Today, it wasn't her home anymore, it was a battlefield. And she'd already won. A week had passed since the courtroom victory, and Henry Davis had moved swiftly. The house was sold under a private listing. The buyer a quiet couple from out of town, unaware of the drama that clung to its walls. The proceeds were secured, soon to be transferred to a trust for elderly support programs, a decision Eleanor had made with a clarity that felt like sunlight after a storm. But first, there was this, the final act of justice. A court bailiff stood on the porch, flanked by 2 uniformed officers, their faces impassive under the rain. In his gloved hand, he held an eviction notice, its edges curling in the damp. Neighbors gathered under umbrellas, their whispers a soft hum beneath the patter of drops. Mrs. Dorothy Evans stood across the street, her eyes wide as dinner plates, her phone already recording. The Johnson kid's mother clutched a thermos, her expression a mix of shock and grim satisfaction. Willow Creek's gossip mill was churning, and Eleanor's story was its fuel. The front door opened, and James appeared, his face pale as ash. He froze, mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Sarah emerged behind him, her hair disheveled, her designer purse nowhere in sight. Mr. and Mrs. Brooks, the bailiff asked, his voice calm, as if confirming a lunch order. They nodded, numbly, unable to speak. The bailiff unfolded the notice and read, his words cutting through the rain. This residence has been legally sold. You are hereby required to vacate the premises within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in forced removal by court order. Sarah let out a strangled noise, half scream, half choke, and gripped the doorframe as if it could anchor her. James stared at the bailiff, then at the notice, his hands shaking so violently the papers nearly slipped into a puddle. Eleanor watched from the corner, her breath steady, the rain tracing down her face like a single tear she didn't bother to wipe away. She saw her living room through the open door, the walls where she'd hung William's fishing hat, the fireplace where she'd taught Liam to toast marshmallows on winter nights. Those memories were hers, not theirs, and they couldn't be evicted. But the house itself, she'd let it go, not out of defeat, but because she was done letting it chain her. Dorothy Evans crossed the street, her umbrella bobbing, and joined a cluster of neighbors. After all she did for them, she said, loud enough for others to hear, they thought they'd get away with it. Another neighbor, Mr. Holbrook, shook his head. You can't treat family like that and expect no consequences. The words carried, and Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wild with humiliation. James's voice broke the silence, hoarse and desperate. This is a mistake. My mother would never. The bailiff cut him off, handing him a thick envelope. All documents are enclosed: ownership transfer, sale confirmation, eviction authorization. Review them with your counsel if you choose. James clutched the papers, his knuckles white, as Sarah sank onto the doorstep, sobbing openly, her hands covering her face. Eleanor's gaze lingered on her son. She remembered him at 8, running barefoot across the kitchen tiles, his laughter filling the house. She saw William, humming as he chopped vegetables for their anniversary dinners, and Liam, his small hands clutching a watering can in the garden. Those moments were her legacy, not the bricks and mortar James and Sarah had coveted. The ache in her chest wasn't grief. It was the weight of a truth fully realized. They'd loved her house more than they'd ever loved her. She turned away, her steps steady, the umbrella shielding her from the rain, but not from the neighbors' stares. They parted for her, some nodding with quiet respect, others whispering her name like a legend. She felt like a tree, uprooted but replanted, her roots sinking deeper into soil of her own choosing. Back at Studio 7, Eleanor hung her wet coat and brewed a pot of jasmine tea, its scent filling the small space. The eviction notice's echo lingered, but it was the community's response that resonated louder. Dorothy had organized a neighborhood meeting that evening. Maggie had texted to set the record straight about James and Sarah's actions. Willow Creek wasn't just watching, it was holding them accountable. Eleanor sat at her table, opening the photo album she'd salvaged. A picture of Liam, holding a sparkler, glowed under the lamplight. Her heart twisted, but she didn't falter. She'd fought for him, too, ensuring the house's proceeds would help others, not fuel Sarah's greed. She'd signed the final sale papers that morning with Henry, her hand steady, each stroke a declaration of freedom. The money was no longer theirs to claim, and neither was she. Her phone buzzed Maggie again. "Town's on your side. Ellie, Dorothy's meeting is packed. They're calling you a hero." Eleanor smiled faintly, warmth spreading through her. She wasn't a hero, just a woman who'd refused to disappear. But the support, the voices of Silver Resilience, the neighbors' whispers, they were her armor now. She stood, stretching her tired joints, and walked to the window. The rain had stopped, leaving Willow Creek's arts district shimmering under streetlights. She thought of the courtroom, the bailiff's voice, the look on Sarah's face as her world crumbled. They'd underestimated her, thinking shame would silence her. But shame was a chain, and she'd broken it. Eleanor sipped her tea, the cup warm in her hands. The fight wasn't over. James and Sarah would come for her, desperate and cornered. But she was ready. The studio, once a refuge, was now her stronghold, its walls alive with her resolve. Outside, the town whispered her name, and inside, Eleanor felt it. She wasn't buried. She was in full bloom. The Willow Creek night was thick with the hum of cicadas, their song weaving through the Arts District's narrow alleys. Eleanor Brooks stood in Studio 7's cramped kitchenette, folding a patchwork quilt she'd been stitching for days. The fabric squares, faded blues, and soft yellows felt like pieces of herself, sewn back together after years of unraveling. Her fingers moved with quiet precision, the needle's rhythm a counterpoint to the storm still settling in her heart. The eviction had been a victory, but Eleanor knew the war wasn't over. James and Sarah wouldn't fade quietly. A frantic pounding shattered the silence, echoing down the hallway like a heartbeat gone wild. Eleanor froze, her needle poised mid-stitch. Muffled shouts followed, James's voice raw and desperate. "Mom, please, open the door." Sarah's voice joined, thinner, cracked with panic. "We can fix this." Eleanor. "You can't leave us like this." Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she stayed rooted, her breath steady. She set the quilt down, deliberate, and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. James stood hunched, his face haggard, alone. Sarah was gone. Eleanor's hand hovered over the lock, a flicker of the old instinct to comfort her son tugging at her. She saw him at 6, sobbing after a nightmare, clinging to her as she whispered, "I'm here, always." But that boy was a memory, buried under the man who'd locked her out. She stepped back, leaving the door closed, and spoke through the thin wood, her voice calm but unyielding. "What do you want?" "James." A sob broke from him, ragged and raw. "Sarah left me. Mom." She took Liam and went to her parents. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. Please, let me in." "I'm sorry." His words trembled, heavy with regret. But Eleanor heard the undercurrent panic. Not love. He wasn't here for her. He was here for salvation from his own ruin. She leaned against the door, her forehead cool against the wood. You chose the house over me. James, you stood by while Sarah threw my life on the lawn. Why should I open this door?" Her voice didn't waver, though her heart ached for the boy he'd been, not the man he'd become. "I was wrong," he choked out, his fist thudding softly against the door. "I thought it was for Liam, for our future. Sarah convinced me you'd be fine, that you didn't need the house. I see it now. Mom, please, give me a chance to make it right." Eleanor closed her eyes, picturing the note taped to her door, the click of the lock, Sarah's sneer. She thought of Liam, his text asking if she hated him, and the trust she'd fight to preserve. "You made your choice," she said, her words steady as stone. "You have to live with it, just as I've lived with your betrayal." She stepped away, the silence between them louder than his pleas. James's voice cracked into sobs, then faded to exhausted murmurs. "Mom, please, think of Liam." The mention of her grandson stung, but Eleanor swallowed the urge to soften. They'd used Liam as leverage before, dangling his future to justify their greed. "No more." She returned to the quilt, her hands resuming their work, each stitch a reaffirmation of her boundaries. Eventually, the hallway fell silent, James's footsteps retreating into the night. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the Willow Creek Community Center, a tray of her homemade lemon scones in hand. She'd started teaching a weekly sewing class, a suggestion from Maggie Thompson's Silver Resilience Group, and the room was already alive with chatter. Clara and Ruth, her new friends, greeted her with warm smiles, their needles flashing through fabric as they shared stories of their own reclaiming. Eleanor felt a quiet pride, her place among them as natural as the thread in her hands. But the town's pulse was restless. Maggie had texted earlier Dorothy's neighborhood meeting turned into a spectacle. Sarah showed up, tried to play victim, got torn apart. Eleanor learned the details at the center. Sarah had stormed into the meeting, claiming Eleanor had stolen their home. But Dorothy Evans had stood, her voice sharp. "You threw her out like trash, Sarah. Don't cry now that the trash fought back." Neighbors had piled on, recounting Eleanor's years of kindness baking for block parties, babysitting their kids until Sarah fled, her face burning with shame. Eleanor listened, her needle pausing. The community's support was a shield, but it couldn't erase the ache of Liam's absence. That evening, alone in the studio, she opened her photo album, lingering on a picture of Liam in the garden, his hands muddy from planting roses. Guilt flickered. Had she been too hard? Cutting James off so completely, could she have saved Liam from his parents' mistakes? But then she remembered the Silver Resilience women, their stories of boundaries drawn to protect their hearts. She wasn't abandoning Liam, she was teaching him. One day, what strength looked like. Her phone buzzed. A voicemail from James. She deleted it without listening, her fingers steady. She'd heard his apologies, seen his tears. They were empty, born of loss, not love. She poured a cup of jasmine tea, its scent grounding her, and resumed her sewing. The quilt was nearly done, its pattern a map of her survival. Outside, Willow Creek hummed, its lights flickering like stars. Eleanor thought of the trust fund, now active, helping women like Clara and Ruth rebuild their lives. She thought of the house, no longer hers, but no longer theirs, its sale a final severing of chains. And she thought of James, alone in his motel room, learning the cost of his choices. She held up the quilt, its stitches tight and true, and let a small smile bloom. "They only miss me now that I said no," she whispered. The words, soft but fierce. The studio's walls seemed to nod, her sanctuary now a testament to her strength. Eleanor folded the quilt and set it aside, ready for tomorrow's class. The fight was over, but her life was just beginning. The early morning light slipped through the blinds of Studio 7, bathing Eleanor Brooks's small space in a soft, golden glow. She rose before the sun, as she had for weeks now, wrapping herself in a faded robe and brewing a pot of jasmine tea. The ritual was her own, no longer shaped by others' demands. The studio, once a dusty relic of her past, had become her home. Potted herbs lined the windowsill, their green leaves vibrant against the cracked paint. The patchwork quilt, finished at last, lay folded on the armchair, its stitches a quiet testament to her rebirth. Eleanor sipped her tea, the cup warm in her hands, and gazed out at Willow Creek's arts district. The town was waking, its streets stirring with the clatter of shop shutters and the chatter of early risers. For years she'd felt separate from this bustle, too old, too invisible to belong. But now, as she watched a young artist carry a canvas across the street, she felt alive, part of the world's endless motion. The house on Maple Lane, with its rose bushes and memories, was gone. But she wasn't. She'd survived. No, she'd thrived. Her phone buzzed. A message from Henry Davis. The trust fund is fully operational. First grants went out to day shelters, support programs, all in your name. You've changed lives. Ellie. Eleanor's chest warmed. Not with pride, but with purpose. The proceeds from the house sale, once a chain tying her to James and Sarah's greed, were now a lifeline for women like her, women told to shrink, to sacrifice, to disappear. She typed a quick reply, "Thank you, Henry, for everything." She set the phone down and opened her photo album, pausing on a picture of Liam, his eyes wide with joy as he held a sparkler on a summer night. The ache for her grandson lingered, a bruise that hadn't fully healed. She'd wrestled with guilt, wondering if cutting James off had severed her tie to Liam, too. But last night, at the sewing class, Clara from Silver Resilience had shared a story of her own estranged daughter, now reaching out after years of silence. Kids find their way back, Clara had said, her voice steady. But you can't wait in a cage for them. Eleanor traced Liam's face, whispering, "I'll be here, sweetheart, when you're ready." She closed the album, not with pain, but with acceptance. The community center was her anchor now. She'd expanded her sewing class, teaching women like Ruth and Clara to stitch quilts that told their own stories. The room buzzed with laughter and the hum of needles, a far cry from the silent dinners at Maple Lane, where she'd tiptoed around Sarah's moods. Yesterday, Maggie Thompson had joined, her silver hair catching the light as she fumbled with a needle. "You're a natural, Ellie," Maggie had said, grinning. "You've turned this place into a home for us all." Eleanor had blushed, but the words settled deep, rooting her in this new life. Willow Creek had claimed her story, too. The gossip that once stung now sang her praises. Mrs. Dorothy Evans, ever the town crier, had spread word of the trust fund. And neighbors stopped Eleanor on the street, offering thanks or baked goods. The Johnson kid's mother had slipped her a jar of homemade jam, muttering, "You showed 'em, Eleanor." The town's support wasn't just kindness, it was recognition, a mirror reflecting the strength she'd always had, but never seen. But the past still whispered. James's voicemails, deleted unheard, had stopped days ago. Maggie had heard he was living in a motel, working odd jobs after Sarah left with Liam. Sarah, Dorothy claimed, was back with her parents, her designer dreams unraveling in their debt-ridden home. Eleanor felt no joy in their downfall, only a clean emptiness where their hold on her used to be. They'd taught her, brutally, that love without respect was a transaction, and she'd closed that account for good. She dressed for the day, choosing a simple blouse and the pearl brooch she'd worn at William's funeral. It gleamed against her chest. A reminder of his words, "Quiet doesn't mean weak." Ellie. She grabbed her purse and a folder of trust fund reports, heading for Henry's office downtown. The walk was brisk, the July air warm but fresh, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine from a nearby stall. Passers-by nodded, some calling her name, and Eleanor smiled, her steps light, as if she were gliding just above the pavement. Henry greeted her with a tired but genuine smile, his oak desk buried in papers. "You're a force." "Ellie," he said, reviewing the trust fund's impact, 3 shelters funded, 10 women enrolled in job training. "This is bigger than you, now." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. "It's for them," she said, her voice low. "For every woman who's been told she's nothing." As she left, the sky was streaked with gold, the first hints of sunset painting Willow Creek in warmth. Eleanor paused at a bookstore, buying a journal to sketch quilt patterns, then stopped by the flower shop for a pot of lavender. Each choice was hers, small but deliberate, weaving a life no one could take. Back at the studio, she arranged the lavender on the windowsill, its scent mingling with the herbs. Soft music played from her dusty radio, and threads scattered across the table, a canvas of possibility. She sat with her tea, the quilt draped over her lap, and looked out at the city's glow. The pain of Maple Lane, of James's betrayal, Sarah's greed. Liam's absence hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined her. She was Eleanor Brooks, not a mother or caretaker, but a woman, whole and free. The trust fund, the sewing class, the neighbors' nods, they were her legacy now, not a house or a family that never valued her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor closed her eyes, the city's hum a lullaby. She thought of Liam, hoping he'd grow to know her strength. She thought of William, his voice a quiet echo. "You're enough, Ellie." And she thought of herself, standing under the golden sky, no longer invisible. "I didn't just survive," she whispered, her smile soft but fierce. "I've bloomed."